Welcome to the Two Gurus Talk Compliance podcast with me, Kristy Grant-Hart. I'm here with the one and only Tom Fox, and this week we are covering Bank of America's fake account scandal, a chief compliance officer who allegedly paid off whistleblowers, the new non-lawyer head of the Serious Fraud Office, and Florida man's latest bribery exploits. But first, Tom, how has your week been, and what do you think is the most interesting development?
Well, I am with 11 guys I went to law school with. We get
Ooh, that's
together
fun.
every year, and we are in northern Wisconsin, and it's been great. September will be our 40th law school reunion. So, been knowing these guys a long time.
Wow, how many of you are up there?
11 of us.
11. Wow, total. That's amazing. Congratulations. That's really exciting.
It is very cool. So,
Awesome. Well, let's start with the other side of the world from Wisconsin. Let's start with Singapore.
yeah. So for those who haven't been following the news, or at least the compliance/corruption news, there's a huge corruption scandal ongoing in Singapore. We've had one minister resign under investigation. We now have 3 total investigations. It's broadened out into several other areas. And here, both Harry Casson and Dick Casson have lived a long time in Singapore. They both reside in the U.S. now, but Harry basically grew up in Singapore, and so as a teenager, and then he went to college in the U.S. And he wrote a really heartfelt blog post in the FCPA blog. It was basically what happened to my beloved Singapore, and he had 2 possible reasons for this. One is that the Singapore has really changed over the past 10 and maybe even the last 5 years. The Singapore of 10 years ago has gone because people have fled Hong Kong. And whereas Hong Kong was literally APAC's banking center, because of the Communist Chinese takeover of Hong Kong, that's no longer available to them, or for political reasons they've left, or they're Europeans and they've left for whatever the reason, they relocated to Singapore, which of course always was a major banking center. And it's really changed the character of the city. A lot more people, a lot more money. You can just tell the difference if you were there 15 years, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. So that could be one possibility. The other possibility he relates is that this was going on all along, and they just either it was hushed up or it was never talked about. But the Petrobras scandal involving Keppel offshore unleashed forces in Singapore, and I would even add Goldman Sachs and 1MDB as well, contributed to a culture which would either look more deeply into itself and or report if it found nefarious conduct. So for whatever the reason, Singapore is now in the midst of a corruption scandal. It's not clear how large it will be. It's not clear if Singapore will lose its sort of vaulted position it's had for years as 1, 2, or 3 on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, but something is going on.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciated the heartfelt nature of the account that he wrote. But at the same time, I mean, one of the things he posited was that it had been going on forever. And perhaps I'm just a cynic, but it seems to me that people are people, and the idea that no one in the country was motivated by greed, or that they were too afraid to ever, utilize especially government positions seems very unlikely to me. And Tom, I'm sure you, like I, have worked with companies in Norway and Denmark and all the places where people think corruption never happens. You know, you go in to do training there and they kind of look at you like you're crazy. Like, what are you doing here? Corruption doesn't exist here. And like, yes, it does. Here, example 1, 2, 5. I mean, what's your take? Do you think he's right that it's just different, or do you think it just is different in terms of people talking about it?
Well, I have done lots of speaking in Singapore. I practiced law in Singapore. I've done training in Singapore. And up till about 5 years ago, my sense was, at least in our community, the compliance community, people were quite proud of that ranking. They were quite proud of the fact that Singapore was unlike other parts of APAC. And so I tend to think it's the influx. Having said that, Keppel Offshore made clear that it was going on. And it took a worldwide corruption scandal, which Petrobras was, to really expose that. And, in an earlier podcast, I think it was Dick Casson, we talked about an article or series of articles he wrote about the reasons for continued corruption, and one of which was the just explosion of cash across the globe. And that is certainly true in Singapore. It is a gleaming night jewel. I used to say it was the jungle had been tamed, but it's far beyond that now. If you've only haven't been there since the pandemic, so there's so much money in there. Maybe it's just the inevitable nature of humans.
Interesting. No, I haven't been to Singapore since the pandemic. So see if I can get myself out there, because they have the night zoo there where you can see the porcupines running around and you have the flying foxes. It's absolutely amazing. So anyone going to Singapore, Gleaming Jewel, as well as the night zoo, it's amazing. Okay, let's talk about the state of compliance, right? Not just in Singapore, but across the world. So I want to talk about our industry focusing on what's being seen as most important to compliance officers. And a couple of weeks ago, I co-presented a webinar with Carrie Penman, our friend of Navex, analyzing the results of their annual Harris Poll survey. So this year, over 1,300 compliance officers responded, many from abroad as well as in the United States. And the survey was wide-ranging and looked at a number of topics, but I really want to focus on the risk areas that compliance officers are focused on now, as well as the risk areas they plan on training on in the next couple of years. So when it comes to issues compliance officers report to have dealt with in the past 3 years, the highest percentage cited data breach or cybersecurity. Well, that's not surprising, right? However, Tom, it used to be that bribery always ruled the roost for training and regulatory concerns, but weirdly, it's not so much anymore. So when asked on a sliding scale how important various compliance-related topics were to the organization, regulatory compliance tied in importance with data privacy and security, but bribery came in last on the list. And perhaps even more surprisingly, DEI scored higher than both bribery and whistleblowing/non-retaliation. And then the next question was looking at the types of training that compliance officers expect to deploy in the next 2 to 3 years. And that really mirrored what they said they were concerned with. So 60%, the top of the list, was planning on training on cybersecurity in the next 2 to 3 years. But anti-bribery and corruption training was only a third. Only a third of companies were planning ABAC training. And at least compliance officers are aligning their concerns with their training approaches, because DEI training topped whistleblower reporting and retaliation by 9 percentage points. Now, Tom, there's a lot to unpack here. What struck you most from this excerpt of the survey analysis?
Well, all very interesting. It did not surprise me that bribery or anti-bribery, anti-corruption, ABC, had moved down the list. I was a little surprised how far it went down the list. The things that you articulated or listed at the top did not seem to were not a surprise to me. I'm going to throw in messaging app compliance in with the regulatory compliance, because I think that's on everyone's front of minds now. Certainly cyber, now data privacy, data security. I'm going to throw data security in with cybersecurity, and then DEI, although that may have shifted after the Supreme Court ruling, which was pre-survey results. So, who knows about that? On the other hand, I was a little bit heartened to see bribery that low. Maybe what we've been doing all along has gotten some traction. So maybe we should have a moment of pride that it's down there, although not in Singapore.
Yeah, right. I actually, you know what, that's a really good point. I mean, I think, and it also may tie back to the things that we were talking about, I think, on our last episode about the lack of big explosive DOJ actions without those, big superstar numbers and multiple individuals, et cetera, maybe that also reflects the less of a focus it feels like from the DOJ, or less of the threat that is perceived in that.
Perhaps.
Okay.
The next one, when I first heard about this, I was just aghast at this. And it's Bank of America, or a BOA, had a $180 million enforcement action, generally involving 3 areas of concern. One was a junk fee scheme where they charged customers for declined transactions due to insufficient funds, withholding of cash and reward reports on credit cards. But here's the one that got me, which was fraudulent account opening. Sound familiar to anyone? Well, it should, because of course that was Wells Fargo. And this started before the Wells Fargo scandal became public, but it continued thereafter. And that was just beyond me, how Bank of America would be so unaware of not simply the biggest banking scandal in the history of America since probably 1907, well, maybe the Great Depression. But Bank of America was noted to have a perverse incentive program where they incentive compensation was based on number of accounts you open. And what happens when that's what your incentive program is? People open accounts. And that's what happened at Wells Fargo. Well, that incentive program lasted up until this year. So somebody wasn't paying attention. And after I sort of got over my aghastness at all of this, I thought this was a really important lesson learned case, Kristy, because it shows that you need to know what your competitors are doing, if they're in enforcement actions, if verticals next to you or adjacent to you are in enforcement actions, because you need to be aware if something's happening over there and maybe happening over here. So I'm not quite sure how BOA got such a low result given what happened to Wells Fargo. The DOJ has not weighed in on this matter yet, so there may be additional enforcement actions involved. We don't know one way or the other, but $180 million fine to the SEC, or excuse me, the CFPB.
Tom, you sent over Matt Kelly's extremely detailed analysis of this from Radical Compliance. And if you don't know anything about this case or haven't heard about this, go read it, because it is amazing. I like you, aghast is the right word. Just, it's not possible that they didn't know. The CEO of Wells Fargo was dragged before Congress. People were fired at the highest levels. There's a person in jail. We talked about this. One of the salespeople is who was ahead of this thing is in jail right now for this. This cannot be an oversight. I mean, to a certain degree, you go, okay, well, no one had gotten in real trouble for this before, but that program still being in place this year is just shocking. I don't understand. It will be interesting to see if this grows the legs that the Wells Fargo problems had, in terms of everyone talking about the culture issues there, in terms of the congressional insight and oversight of this and importance of it, etc. Frankly, I think it may just get an also ran kind of feeling. And I wonder if that was part of the risk assessment of people just saying, we're just going to keep doing it until we can't. It's just really a frightening case. I find it literally shocking.
So, yes, to all the above.
There's nothing else we could say about it. It's just, oh my God. Okay. So let's move from the Bank of America over to the across the pond, right? This next article comes from the Wall Street Journal, and it's titled "Former Top London Police Officer to Head UK Serious Fraud Office." So there's a big transition taking place at the SFO right now, with the former head leaving after what I think, Tom, we could safely call a mixed tenure. What is novel here is that the new head of the SFO is not a lawyer. So he was a senior London police officer at the Metropolitan Police Service, and has also had senior roles on the Surrey Police Force and with the UK National Police Chiefs Council. So the UK Attorney General praised the new head as being, and I'm quoting here, the ideal candidate, unquote, to head the organization because of his past work in law enforcement. So as you know very well, the previous administration has had its problems I found this amazing in the Wall Street Journal article. It said that a former director of public prosecution, who was also a high court judge, was conducting a review of the SFO, and he said there was a cultural issue, including, and quoting the Wall Street Journal, shoddy record keeping, inadequate resourcing of cases, and a lack of understanding of priorities between the case team and senior management. Unquote. No one wants that in their culture survey, do they? So Tom, we've got a non-lawyer who is going to be running the SFO. What is your take? Is this a good move?
Well, first of all, you should never have an American run the SFO. Period. End of statement.
That was the previous one.
Yeah. Yes. So that to me was a huge gaffe, and it played out that way. I find it. Part of my remarks are because of the prior director, or excuse me, she's not prior. She still is until the end of September. But her tenure was charitably mixed. And I think it was a breath of fresh air to bring in someone like this. When you have problems that of the nature that were found in the report, you often bring in someone with a military background, and I'm going to throw the police into that, because very structured, very rigorous in the way they think through policies, procedures, documents, decisions, all of those things, whether you call that by the book or not. And that may be what they need right now. And certainly to have a former police officer, former investigator at the head, I think will bring rigor around their decisions to investigate and their decisions to prosecute, that a type of rigor we haven't seen under prior directors. So I see it as a breath of fresh air. They obviously had to do something, and I think fairly dramatic, to try to turn the SFO around. It's still an open question, although the shadow labor government says they're not going to disband the SFO. I don't know what the Tories would do if they won the next election or not.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. But going from, we're still across the pond, going from the UK to the Netherlands. Tom, what do you want to talk about next?
Just wow. This is a PG podcast, so I really can't say what I think, but this is just unbelievable. KPMG gets caught cheating again around accounting tests, this time in the country of the Netherlands. KPMG has admitted over 500 employees were involved in this. The managing director of KPMG Netherlands has resigned. The head of the board of supervisors has resigned. If this story sounds familiar, well, yes, it is. KPMG paid a $50 million fine to the PCAOB for cheating a few years back in America. They had a problem in the United Kingdom. I think they had a problem in Australia. I was on the phone with a mutual friend of ours who I didn't realize he was a CPA, but he is. And I said, look, when you're a CPA, all you have is your word. Is people trust the numbers you generate are real. And he said, absolutely. And this is a complete trust issue. And how can you trust an audited statement, any kind of financial review, if people have to cheat to get their licenses so they can do the work? I thought that when Francine McKenna blasted KPMG over this in the US version of this scandal, and now we've got it here. We've got, I don't care how separate and distinct each one of these KPMG country/business units are, but there is a clear culture of cheating on exams across this organization, and somebody needs to not just stop it, but completely turn it around.
Tom, this article, I honestly, between the Bank of America and the KPMG article, my head was exploding with the things that you sent to me. This article, while short, it was about 4 or 5 paragraphs. It included the fact that, of course, EY and PwC have both had fines for this same behavior. And the Big Four it's amazing to me that they will never, nothing ever knocks them off their pedestal. It never happens. It never will happen. I mean, every company that I work with, all the multinationals, well, doesn't matter. We have Big Four. It's insanity. But the best part of the article for me by far was the person who was trying to describe why his conduct had happened. And he said he misunderstood a training session. They had 5 years of fraud, right? Of fraudulent behavior. And that was because he misunderstood a training session. I said that to my husband. I was like sitting there going, my goodness, I can't believe this. And Jonathan said, I'll just tell the officer if I get caught speeding that I misunderstood the part on the driving exam about the numbers on the side and see how that goes. It's unbelievable.
Exactly. So,
Oh,
yeah.
but
But it doesn't end there. FTX has news for us.
oh man, this is so much fun today. I love this with you, Tom, right? But this one is particularly fun today. I just love all of this. So our next article is back to our friends from the FCPA blog, and it involves the wrongdoing of a chief compliance officer. Oh my heavens. It's titled Former FTX GC and Chief Compliance Officer Helped Insiders Divert Billions, complaint alleges. We should note this is just a complaint, so we don't know for sure, but the details are fantastic. So a trustee for the bankrupt cryptocurrency firm FTX Group recently filed a civil complaint against the former GC and CCO of the company for being a fixer who helped divert billions, that's with a B, billions, to company insiders. So not only did he allegedly divert this money to insiders, but the CCO also paid off whistleblowers and their lawyers. Whoops. 2 days, coincidentally, after the lawyer left the company, control of FTX was taken from our best buddy, Sam Bankman-Fried, better known to his friends as SBF. So the chief compliance officer at FTX pocketed a cool $3 million in bonuses during his slightly less than 2-year stint at the company. And according to the complaint, he also received cryptocurrency worth tens of millions of dollars, as well as a signing bonus of 1.4 million and an award of 8% of the equity in FTX's US operations. So that equity share on the cryptocurrency, Tom, $25 still? Not sure, maybe 20. Anyway, maybe slightly different worth now than it was. But the article finishes by reminding us that the CECO's job was to ensure that FTX companies had the appropriate internal controls, risk mitigation, and compliance processes. I'm pretty sure we can definitively say that FTX had none of those in place. So this is a good one, Tom. I have not heard of a GC or CCO paying off whistleblowers and their lawyers. Will wonders never cease?
Well, more charitably, perhaps we can call that a settlement.
Fair enough.
So we had some news from the Department of Justice. Kenneth Polite, Assistant Attorney General and head of the Criminal Division, has announced he is leaving the DOJ at the end of this month. And in a article in the Wall Street Journal, once again by our friend Dylan Tokar, he sort of reviewed and reflected back a little bit on his tenure as head of the Criminal Division and talked about where it may be headed down the road. A large part of his remarks were around data analytics, Matt Galvin going over to the Department of Justice, and how the DOJ was really going to have the ability to data mine publicly available information to see if companies were in compliance. And I think in the FCPA world, this is going to be a complete game changer, because just as the SEC can data mine 10Ks and 8Qs, if the Department of Justice can do the same with public data and just send a little letter over saying, we'd like to see your compliance program on this issue, I think it will really enhance and move forward the DOJ's ability to prosecute FCPA cases. Now, this is also in the context of enforcement is way down. It was down the first year of the Biden administration. It has continued to be down, and lots of questions around that. You and I have both been to the same conferences where they say, just wait, it's coming. Just wait, it's coming. Just wait, it's coming. We're waiting. And so we haven't seen a large number of enforcement actions, nor have we seen large dollar enforcement actions. And then the thing, though, that he will always be remembered for in the compliance community is something he didn't touch on, which was CCO certification. And he was at least publicly, the face of the DOJ deciding to require CCOs to certify the completions of deferred prosecution agreements under a standard of effectiveness of compliance as defined under the deferred prosecution agreement. He seems to think and has publicly articulated that this will enhance the authority of the CCO, give greater prestige to the position, and perhaps lead to more resources. At least for myself, I'm worried about potential personal liability of a CCO that makes such certification, and it turns out something goes wrong. And I have suggested if you're a CCO or going to be one in that position, you should ask about D&O coverage, both civil and criminal.
So do you think that this policy, as it were, goes away with him? Do you think that it quietly isn't something that happens, or do you think that it will continue to be the position of the DOJ that certification is required at the end of a DPA?
I think it will continue. Very few policies that they have taken up have I seen sort of either stop or quietly go away. In fact, I was trying to think of an answer, think of that situation, and really the only time I can think of is around the turn of the century, sort of Enron, World Check time frames. The DOJ made very clear that they expected waiver of attorney-client privilege in and there was significant pushback on that, and that did stop. But you rarely see a DOJ put forward a policy, at least in our arena, and then drop it.
Well, it'll be interesting because to a certain degree, he won't see the fallout of that decision, except from the whatever law firm he goes to and enjoys the other side. So we wish him luck. We wish him well. And it'll be interesting to see how the things he either put in place or was participating in, especially with respect to data mining, data analytics, and with the CCO certification, where that goes from here. So again, stay tuned and wait and watch with your popcorn for the more actions that are coming down the bend, we hope. Let's completely switch gears here. I know, Tom, I think May, you were at the Compliance Week National Conference. You talked about all the great things that happened there. I'm really impressed with what they're doing lately. The next thing I want to cover is actually a roundup of some of the lessons learned by Amy Barnard-Bonn, who's our friend, from the Women in Compliance Conference that was hosted a couple of weeks ago in Atlanta, Georgia. So Compliance Week did something interesting. They had the Women in Compliance Conference and their third-party conference happening at the same time in the same hotel. I got to speak at both of them, and both were great. But Amy was focused on a couple of different sessions, one of which I thought was particularly good, which was dealing with imposter syndrome. So not just in the context of women, but in general. And there were two tips I really liked about countering this, if you are feeling like you're not enough or you're a fraud or any of that stuff. So the first one was to essentially tell the voice in your head all the reasons that you are in fact good enough, trying to use facts. So for instance, if I were feeling like an imposter going on stage, I can say things that are true, like I've been part of the Professional Speakers Association, or I've spoken in front of much larger audiences than whatever this one is. And people in the profession can use this, reminding themselves of their credentials, reminding themselves of all of their successes in order to really counter that voice and say, you're just wrong. And the second one was to mindfully choose confidence instead of listening to fear. So the author quotes my friend, Michelle Davis, who was on the panel and said, and quote, "Don't subscribe to fake it till you make it. You aren't faking anything. You are there for a reason. Reframe intimidating situations as choosing confidence," unquote, which I really loved. I think that it's really difficult to balance the sort of women aspect of women in compliance and also to really hit on topics that are very important to both genders in being successful, or all genders, I suppose, in being successful. So I think they're doing some great stuff lately, and exciting to be a part of that ecosystem.
So I have to start off by shouting out to Mary Shirley and Lisa Fine. And I have told them that this conference is a direct outgrowth of what they started. And they started a podcast called Great Women in Compliance, Wikis, for those in the know. They started a LinkedIn community around that. That community grew. Lisa and Mary wrote a book about their experiences. Mary's about to publish a second book. Mary has just stepped down as a co-host, and we have a new host will start in September. But the thing that excited me so much about this conference was I saw their idea, and their idea was the following. They came up to me at a conference and said, Tom, you don't have enough gender diversity in your podcast network. And I said, you're right. Why don't you guys start a podcast? And that's how it started. And from that germ of an idea, they built a community that not only highlighted women, but supported women. And it wasn't limited to women, because I was on their podcast and I was a happy part of GWIC, just as several other males, Jay Rosen, Nick Gallo, and lots of others proudly call ourselves Gwickies. But then Compliance Week picked up on that. And I think it was the first conference after the pandemic. They had a luncheon, Great Women in Compliance luncheon, or Great Women in Compliance luncheon. They didn't say Great Women in Compliance. And the next year they had a half-a-day panel. And so I saw that grow. And then those were both so successful and so popular that they had the conference that you participated in and Amy wrote about. And so what really struck me, Kristy, was that you may not think what you do today will change the world, but I think those ladies changed the world. And I think that that's a perfect lesson. They were as scared as you can imagine when they started, but they did it, and they walked through that door and they did it. And the lesson I really would want to try to convey is, yeah, you may not feel like you've only got 3 of the 5 characteristics for that job offer. Oh, I don't have all 5. I can't do it. Whereas I would go, well, gosh, I got more than half. They can't live without me. Walk through that door and see what happens. Lisa and Mary had no idea where they were going. And that conference, Compliance Week, had no idea 3 years ago of the power of that conference. So kudos to Compliance Week for picking up on that and then bringing it forward in a way that you're right. It was absolutely inclusive. And, it wasn't just women sitting around talking about how we're going to take over compliance. It was women sitting around talking about substantive issues, how we can support each other and how we can make compliance better. So I was just so gratified that conference. And then I was really skeptical of Compliance Week doing 2 conferences at once like they did, but it turned out to be a brilliant move. So, kudos to FRA, the conference arm, or the Compliance Week sister company who runs these conferences, because that was just a brilliant move. So I thought it was great.
I love everything you just said. And first of all, thank you for bringing great women in compliance to the world. Lloydette Bimaro, who I think has been announced as the new host, is a friend. She has worked with Spark on some projects. She's working with one with us right now over in the UK. I think she's going to be brilliant. And Tom, I'm the luckiest because Mary Shirley has moved about 20 miles from me. So I get to see her all the time now. We're going to lunch next week. So it's the best, and she's the best. And it's just such a great community. Honestly, it really is. So let's go from one great community to a maybe different kind of community. Tom, you brought in Florida, man. What happened with him this week?
Well, I have to say, you just completely inspired me with our last episode when you talked about Florida man. And so I was nosing around to see if there was any Florida man corruption or compliance issues. Well, it turns out Florida man is not limited to Florida, because the Department of Justice convicted a Florida man had him sentenced for 41 months in jail for running scams on largely elderly victims, where he stole $1.5 million. And it's a scam that is alluded to in one of our prior episodes, where he would call and tell someone that their son or daughter or niece or nephew was in jail and needed money immediately to get out. So, this was not done in Florida. Florida man did this in Maryland and in Virginia. So he crossed state lines, which of course made it a federal offense. So Florida man is still out there doing Florida man things.
You know, Tom, I think that the important lesson here is that Florida man should stay in Florida because it's better there. Stay with your kind. Okay. Let's finish off with, I can't finish anything, normally we have to pick something kind of nuts. And so this one is from the BBC and it is titled Farmer Fined $61,000 for using a thumbs up emoji. So here's what happened. In 2021 in Saskatchewan, Canada, a grain buyer named Kent McElborough was looking to purchase 86 tons of flax from a farmer named Chris Archer. So Mr. McElborough spoke on the phone with the farmer about his potential purchase. So far, so good. And then he texted Farmer Chris to follow up saying, please confirm fax contract. Farmer Chris sent back a thumbs up emoji, but he did not deliver the flax. His defense was that he was simply confirming receipt of the contract, not that he was agreeing with the terms. Well, it turns out the court disagreed with him. So the buyer and the farmer had previously agreed to contracts via text, but this is the first time it had been done with emojis. And the court, in a rather funny way, said that while the judge himself was maybe not so great at technology and a late adopter, that actually emojis could very well be a way of signing off, and that anything that says consent is consent. So unfortunately, our farmer had to deliver. This is a reminder, Tom, that your sentences are your friend and emojis should be used judiciously, whether you are a Canadian farmer, crypto bank executive, or a Florida man.
I think that is a perfect way for this podcast to end, Kristy. So I am Tom Fox.
I'm Kristy Grant-Hart. Have a great rest of your week.